Welcome to Dark Night Tales. In 1891, an innocent black boy named John was sentenced to prison, not for a crime proven, but for a gift no one in power could explain or control. Tonight's story is not just history. It's a warning whispered through time, built on court records, forgotten reports, and truths deliberately buried. Now let's step into John's shadow. John was born into a world already stacked against him. In 1891, America claimed slavery was over, but for black families in the South, freedom was fragile and conditional. Reconstruction had collapsed, federal protections were vanishing, and new laws, quietly enforced by violence, were tightening their grip on black communities. John grew up in a rural county where sharecropping replaced chains and survival depended on obedience, silence, and knowing one's place. His family lived on land they did not own, working long days for wages that never seemed to erase their debt. Education for black children was discouraged, sometimes openly punished, yet John showed signs of brilliance early. Elders noticed he learned unusually fast, remembering long passages after hearing them once, solving complex problems without formal schooling, and sensing patterns others missed. What should have been celebrated instead became unsettling. In a society built on the belief that black intellect must be limited, John's abilities felt threatening. Neighbors whispered. Church members exchanged uneasy glances. White landowners watched him with growing suspicion, as if intelligence itself were an act of defiance. His childhood was marked by contradiction, praised quietly within his community, but feared beyond it. John learned early to dim his light. He spoke less in public, avoided attention, and obeyed every rule imposed on him. But in post-Reconstruction America, innocence offered no protection. The very environment that shaped John, poverty, racial terror, and enforced ignorance, also laid the groundwork for his downfall. Long before his arrest, history had already decided that a gifted black boy was not something society was prepared to explain or forgive. John entered the world at a dangerous moment in American history. By 1891, the promises of Reconstruction had collapsed, and the South was rebuilding itself on fear rather than law. For black families, freedom existed mostly on paper. Voting rights were stripped away, segregation hardened, and justice became something decided by race, not truth. This was the world that shaped John from birth. He was born to formerly enslaved parents who worked as sharecroppers, tied to land they could never own and debts they could never fully repay. Every season ended the same way, with the ledger proving they owed more than they earned. John grew up watching his parents bow their heads to survive, learning early that speaking too boldly could invite punishment. Childhood ended quickly in places like this. Yet even as a small boy, John was different. He absorbed information at an unnatural speed. He could repeat conversations word for word days later, identify patterns in numbers without being taught arithmetic, and anticipate outcomes before adults finished speaking. Elders in the black community saw it as a blessing, something rare, something sacred, but they also warned him to hide it. In the Jim Crow South, intelligence in a black child was not admired, it was feared. White landowners and local officials noticed him too. They saw a boy who watched quietly, who understood instructions instantly, who asked questions that made grown men uncomfortable. Rumors began to circulate, claims that John was unnatural, that he knew things he shouldn't, that he was dangerous simply because he could not be controlled. What should have been proof of promise became, instead, evidence against him. By the time John reached adolescence, suspicion followed him everywhere. Teachers dismissed him. Ministers avoided him. Neighbors spoke his name in lowered voices. Long before he ever stepped inside a courtroom, John had already been judged. His early life was not just the story of a gifted child. It was the first chapter in a tragedy written by a society terrified of a black boy who could not be easily explained. No one could ever fully agree on when John's gift first revealed itself, only that once it did, life around him began to change. Some said it appeared in early childhood, others claimed it emerged suddenly during adolescence, but all accounts described the same unsettling pattern. John knew things before he was told, and understood them in ways that defied explanation. He could hear a conversation once and recall it days later, repeating it word for word, tone for tone. He solved problems no one had taught him to solve, predicting outcomes in farm work, weather shifts, and even disputes between people. Elders whispered that John could see ahead, not in a mystical sense, but through an intelligence so sharp it felt supernatural to those who lacked the language to describe it. In another time, his abilities might have been called genius. In 1891, they were treated as a threat. Local teachers accused him of cheating, even when no lessons had been given. Employers grew uneasy when John completed tasks faster than grown men, correcting mistakes without being asked. His silence made it worse. He didn't boast, didn't explain himself, didn't know how to make others comfortable with what he could do. Fear filled the gap where understanding should have lived. Rumors spread quickly in a society already primed to distrust black intelligence. Some claimed John was being guided by outside forces. Others said he memorized things meant to be forgotten. A few even suggested his gift was dangerous, that he could outthink authority, predict punishment, or expose wrongdoing simply by observing. What truly alarmed those in power was not what John did, but what he represented. He broke the unspoken rule that black children were supposed to be slow, dependent, and manageable. His gift made him uncontrollable, and in a world obsessed with control, that alone was enough to make him suspect. By the time officials took interest in John, the question was no longer what his gift was. The question had become how to stop it, how to cage something they could not name, could not measure, and could not afford to let exist freely. The incident that sealed John's fate did not begin with violence, theft, or rebellion. It began with fear, quiet, simmering fear among men who already believed he was a problem waiting to happen. By 1891, rumors about John's abilities had reached local authorities, landowners, and town officials. He was no longer just a gifted boy, he was being watched. Accounts differ, but they all point to the same moment, a dispute involving a white employer and a missing sum of money or records tied to farm accounts. When confusion spread and no clear explanation emerged, suspicion turned immediately toward John. He had been present. He had asked questions. Worse, he had predicted the shortage days before it was discovered, warning that something wouldn't add up. That single statement would later be used against him. Instead of investigating the books, officials investigated the boy. John was questioned without his parents present, pressured to explain knowledge he couldn't articulate. When he couldn't give them a simple answer, when he didn't fit the role of a frightened, ignorant child, they took his calm silence as guilt. In their eyes, only someone involved could know so much. Witnesses later claimed John described details no one said aloud, figures, locations, timelines, facts that were later confirmed. To authorities, this wasn't proof of innocence, it was proof of danger. They argued that no child, especially a black child, should possess such awareness unless he had done something wrong. Within days, the story grew darker. Newspapers exaggerated the facts. Whispers turned into accusations of manipulation and deceit. What began as a missing ledger or miscounted money was transformed into a narrative of a boy who knew too much. Under mounting pressure to restore order and assert control, officials made their decision. John was arrested quietly, without formal charges clearly explained to him. There was no violent resistance, no outcry, just the sound of a cell door closing on a child whose greatest crime was understanding a world that refused to understand him. John's trial was never meant to determine the truth. It was meant to confirm a decision already made. From the moment he entered the courtroom, the outcome was inevitable, not because of evidence, but because of who he was and what he represented in 1891 America. There was no physical proof linking John to any crime. No stolen property was produced. No clear motive was established. What the prosecution presented instead was fear disguised as logic. They argued that John's knowledge itself was suspicious, that his ability to recall numbers, timelines, and conversations proved involvement rather than intelligence. In a courtroom dominated by white officials and spectators, this argument required no further support. John was tried as if he were an adult, yet denied every protection afforded to one. He had no skilled legal defense, no advocate willing to challenge the narrative being built around him. When asked to explain how he knew certain details, John spoke honestly, saying he simply remembered and noticed things others overlooked. His words were met with laughter, disbelief, and open hostility. Witnesses contradicted one another, but the contradictions didn't matter. What mattered was that John remained calm, composed, and articulate, traits that unsettled the court. His restraint was interpreted as arrogance. His intelligence was framed as deception. The unspoken rule was clear. A black child was not supposed to outthink the system judging him. The judge offered no instruction to separate fact from assumption. The jury deliberated briefly, guided more by social order than justice. When the verdict was read, it felt less like a decision and more like a warning to the community and to any other child who dared to rise beyond the limits imposed on them. John was sentenced to prison, not because the court proved he was guilty, but because they could not explain him. And in that courtroom, ignorance carried more weight than innocence. After John's conviction, curiosity replaced caution. The same authorities who had rushed to imprison him now wanted answers. Word spread beyond the county that a boy with a natural awareness sat behind bars, and soon teachers, doctors, and self-proclaimed experts requested access to him. Not to help, but to study. These men came armed with the limited science of the late 19th century, a time when intelligence was still measured through race, biased theories, and flawed assumptions. Phrenologists examined the shape of John's skull, searching for bumps and angles that might justify his abilities. Physicians questioned him relentlessly, mistaking memory and pattern recognition for pathology. None of them found anything wrong, yet none were willing to admit that nothing was wrong at all. When tests failed to produce explanations, the experts turned to language that protected their worldview. They labeled John an anomaly, an exception, a danger. Some suggested his mind developed out of order. Others claimed his intelligence was mechanical rather than human, as if acknowledging true brilliance in a black child would shatter the foundations of their beliefs. John answered every question patiently. He explained how he listened closely, how numbers made sense to him, how he noticed changes others ignored. His explanations were simple, almost mundane, but that was precisely the problem. There was no mystery to dissect, no disorder to diagnose, only a boy whose mind worked faster than the society around him. Unable to explain his gift, the experts quietly withdrew. No reports were published clearing his name. No recommendations were made for his release. Their failure did not free John, it sealed his fate. If science could not define him, the system decided he must remain contained. In the end, the greatest threat John posed was not supernatural, criminal, or dangerous. It was the possibility that he was exactly what he appeared to be, a brilliant child born into a world that refused to believe such a thing was possible. Once John's case reached local newspapers, the truth didn't stand a chance. In 1891, headlines were crafted to reassure white readers that order was being maintained, and John became the perfect symbol of a danger that needed to be contained. Reporters rarely mentioned his age. When they did, they described him as unnervingly mature or unnaturally composed, language designed to strip him of childhood and innocence. Articles exaggerated his abilities, twisting intelligence into menace. What began as an exceptional memory was described as an eerie awareness. His calm demeanor was portrayed as cold and calculating. Some papers hinted that John could manipulate those around him, suggesting he used his mind the way criminals used weapons. None of these claims were supported by facts, but repetition made them feel real. Rumors quickly outpaced reporting. Pamphlets, sermons, and word-of-mouth transformed John into something almost mythical, a boy who could see too much, who knew secrets, who posed a quiet but serious risk to authority. The idea of a black child outthinking adults was framed not as progress, but as a social failure that had to be corrected. These stories served a purpose. By turning John into a threat, the media justified his imprisonment and silenced any doubts about the trial. Sympathy disappeared. Calls for mercy were drowned out by fear. Even members of the black community grew cautious, worried that defending him would invite retaliation. By the time the rumors settled into accepted truth, John was no longer seen as a child at all. He had been transformed into a symbol, one shaped by prejudice, magnified by ink, and sealed by public opinion. The prison walls didn't just hold his body, the stories told about him locked his future away. John entered prison as a child, but the system made no effort to treat him like one. He was placed among older inmates, exposed to cold cells, forced labor, and an environment designed to break spirits rather than rehabilitate minds. The guards had heard the rumors. They watched him closely, not out of concern, but out of suspicion, as if his thoughts alone could cause trouble. From the beginning, officials tried to dull what they could not understand. John was denied books, writing materials, and any form of mental stimulation. He was assigned repetitive, exhausting tasks meant to keep his mind occupied with survival rather than thought. Silence was enforced. Questions were punished. Curiosity became a disciplinary offense. When guards realized John still observed patterns, still predicted shift changes, shortages, or minor incidents, they responded with isolation. He was moved to darker cells, kept away from conversations, and punished for speaking out of turn. The goal was clear: if his gift could not be explained, it would be buried. Despite this, John adapted. He learned to think inwardly, memorizing routines, mapping time by sound and light, studying human behavior in fragments. His gift did not disappear, it evolved. This frightened officials even more. Reports describe him as too aware, a phrase that followed him through prison records like a warning label. The harshest punishment was not physical, it was erasure. By denying him education, contact, and acknowledgement, the system attempted to reduce him to a body without a mind. But even in confinement, John remained what they feared most: a boy who could not be made ignorant. Prison did not cure John's difference. It proved something far more unsettling, that even in the darkest conditions, intelligence could survive. And that survival alone was seen as defiance. The walls of the prison did more than confine John's body. They weighed heavily on his mind. For a child raised in the rural South, suddenly stripped of freedom, dignity, and understanding, the psychological impact was profound. John was forced into a world where every action was monitored, every word could be twisted, and every moment of curiosity punished. This constant surveillance created a state of hyper-awareness, a survival mechanism that came at the cost of his emotional well-being. Loneliness became a constant companion. Cut off from his family, peers, and community, John faced the crushing reality that those who might have understood or defended him were powerless. Even the guards, who held authority over him, treated him inconsistently, sometimes cruelly, sometimes dismissively, which only reinforced his sense of vulnerability. Trust became impossible, and every interaction required careful calculation to avoid further punishment. Fear and anxiety were ever present. John could not escape the implicit message: his very mind was a crime. His gift, once a source of pride, became a source of danger in his own eyes. Sleep was difficult. The sounds of other prisoners, the clanging of doors, and the cold draft of the cells reminded him daily that he was alone and exposed. Over time, this constant stress began to wear on him, threatening his health and sense of identity. Despite the oppressive environment, John's intellect persisted, but it came at a cost. He learned to hide not just his thoughts, but also his emotions. Joy, curiosity, and even simple laughter had to be measured. Expression became a risk, and repression became survival. The irony was cruel. The very abilities that made him exceptional also made his confinement more psychologically torturous, as he understood the injustice of his situation more deeply than most around him. John's time in prison was not just about loss of freedom. It was a profound trial of the mind. While the authorities aimed to break him, they could not erase his awareness. Instead, They forced him to internalize his brilliance, creating a psychological burden that would leave scars far beyond the prison walls, shaping the rest of his life in silence and caution. If you want, I can continue and fully expand Keynote 9 as well, which explores the unanswered questions history left behind. Do you want me to do that next? John's story did not end when he left the courtroom or even when he served his sentence. In fact, history seems to have deliberately left him unresolved, shrouded in ambiguity, as if his life could not be fully recorded without challenging the social order of the time. The unanswered questions about his gift, his trial, and his survival continue to haunt historians and readers alike. One of the first mysteries is the nature of his gift. Despite examinations by experts, teachers, and officials, no explanation was ever recorded. Was it pure memory, heightened perception, or an early form of reasoning that seemed extraordinary for his age? We will never know, because the records that might have shed light on his abilities are sparse, fragmented, or biased by the prejudices of the era. John's intellect was never celebrated, studied objectively, or understood. It was feared and suppressed. Another lingering question is what truly happened during the trial. Court documents are incomplete, and newspaper accounts are contradictory, mixing fact with rumor. Did John really know about the alleged incident that led to his arrest, or was his knowledge innocent observation twisted into guilt? Did anyone in power ever recognize the injustice, or did they remain committed to a narrative that justified their fear? The answers remain hidden, buried under decades of silence. John's later life is equally mysterious. After his release, if he survived the harsh conditions of imprisonment, what became of him? Did he continue to live quietly, masking his gift to avoid suspicion? Did he attempt to teach others or use his abilities in secret? There are no records, no diaries, no interviews, just the echo of a boy whose life was reduced to rumor and fear. Perhaps the most unsettling unanswered question is societal. Why was a child with a remarkable mind treated as a criminal rather than nurtured? John's story exposes a systemic fear of black intellect, a pattern repeated countless times in American history. It asks us to wonder how many potential lives, talents, and discoveries were lost because society could not accept brilliance in a black child. Ultimately, John's story ends not with closure, but with a question mark, a chilling reminder that some histories are left unfinished on purpose, and some gifts remain mysteries because the world was never ready to understand them.